This episode of Around the Layout is brought to you by Highball Graphics. For over 25 years, Highball Graphics has been providing high-quality decals for railroads in New England, Canada, and beyond. With over 2,000 sets in scales N through G, Highball Graphics has you and your project covered. Highball Graphics specializes in custom decal orders, serving freelance railroads worldwide. Check out their easy-to-use website at highballgraphics.com or email them at info@highballgraphics.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. Father's Day is just around the corner, and I'm happy to bring on a father and son team. Welcome, William Sampson and William Sampson. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ray.
Great to have you guys. We got senior, we got junior here, and we got a great model railroading story to share with everybody. Bill Jr. is well known for his Sue the Milwaukee Road YouTube channel. That's a phenomenal channel. How long have you been doing the YouTube channel?
I started probably back in 2012. I started uploading some videos. So 2012 is when it technically started, but then I did actually start creating videos for my dad, just to kind of show him some weathering techniques so I didn't have to repeat them. And then he could just go and look at the video. And that happened like 2015, 2016. And then I got this idea that I thought I could kind of turn it into a little bit more than just a video and started adding to it. And, you know, almost 8 years later, it turns into this whole other animal. So that's kind of what evolved. But it kind of started 2012 to 2015-ish.
Excellent. It's well done, very well produced. We'll talk a bit more about it later as we get into your story, but we've got two very interesting model railroaders that we want to talk to, and with an hour to do it, so I want to roll right into it. Well, let's start with Senior, and why don't you tell us how you got involved in the model railroad hobby?
Well, I imagine it was the first train set that I received probably around 8-9 years old, and it was a Lionel HO scale, and that was put on a 4x6 sheet of plywood by my dad and a couple of loops. Bought me an Athearn Union Pacific F7 to go with the M & St. L Lionel set, and went from there.
Yeah, so you were we'll call it the Lionel era of model trains. 4x6, you got this thing, you got to kind of running around sort of thing.
Yeah, it was just a double loop that my dad had put together, and had a toggle switch so that you could run the inside loop separate from the outer loop. So I could run two. And I played with that probably for, till those teen years when it was time to move on to bigger and better things.
It seems to be like, kind of a thing where you hit those teenage years and you maybe move away from it a little bit, between cars and girls and jobs and that kind of stuff. Was that was the case for you as well?
Right. Yeah. I did grow up in a railroad family. My dad worked as a hostler for the Great Northern in Superior, Wisconsin. And my grandfather also worked out of Superior for the Great Northern. He was a conductor on the Gopher Badger passenger train that ran between St. Paul and Duluth. My other grandfather worked in the Superior yard in a small building that I always would look at every time we'd go over the viaduct between the two grandparents' houses. And he was a clerk, a timekeeper, so we did go and visit him a couple times in that little building in the middle of the yard.
Wow. And
he did get me a cab ride just in the yard.
Yep.
I would say it was a GP9, but it could have been an SD9, SD7, GP7. But I do remember that. So there were those lots of exposure to the railroad every time we would go up north.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of railroad blood in you there between both. What you said, both grandfathers and then your father and and so on. So model
Right.
railroading is in the Sampson blood.
Yeah, and we would go up probably once a month. My parents were real faithful to go up and visit their parents. So once a month we would go up, and I remember distinctly the what I considered orange and black diesels of the Great Northern Railroad, only to find out later that that was actually Pullman green and not black, but they were black to me.
Right.
And I remember the transition into the big sky blue, and I didn't mind it. And then I remembered it turning into green and black, and I thought, didn't know what that really was either in 1970. So that is what I do model then. I do model Great Northern in 1970.
So you're modeling Great Northern 1970, which is what the blue scheme?
It is the merger. March 3rd, 1970 was the merger of those roads, the hill lines, into the Burlington Northern. So I chose that so I could run everything.
Sure. Yeah, that's kind of like your lock spot, that 1970 era. I think we all kind of have seen that, our railroads, our favorite railroads. I know it's happened to me, between the New England Central and the Providence and Worcester, except for mine went from those colors to orange and black of the G and W. And it's kind of hard to take, but it seems like you've kind of accepted a little bit of that merger.
Right. That's what I grew up with. So that's what I remembered. And I didn't probably really start rail fanning until late 70s, about the time I got married and we started having kids and looking for a hobby. So it ended up being model railroading.
That's probably on the time you have a junior. Was that really the thing that sparked you getting back into the model railroading hobby?
Oh, I think it was just to be able to stay home and probably not, slow things down, be a family guy.
Yeah.
Took up a hobby that kind of could do out of the home, and it slowed my roll. So it didn't probably have a whole lot to do with the kids because they were so little, and even Junior didn't get probably going into it until he got his first train set when he was probably 8 or 9.
So you get back into it. They're little. What do you start with? What's the project look like?
Well, we moved into our new house in 1980, and that was the same year Bill was born. So he was a baby. I had a 22 by 22 foot basement that was empty, and I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to build something. So I took about half of that space because the washer and dryer were down there, and I built what would have probably been a 22 by 10 foot railroad, just a loop, because back in 1980 we weren't doing around the wall, we weren't doing shelves, we were still kind of had an operator's pit, and we ran around ourselves. So right. That's what I started with.
What were some kind of your early influences in that? I mean, this is obviously 1980. I was born in 1980, as was Junior here. If anybody doesn't know, the internet didn't exist in 1980. So where were you getting your information? Where were you getting that from?
Yeah, I in junior high I worked as a library aide, and I stumbled across Model Railroader magazine in our catalogs of stuff. And boy, I think I read every one of them they had, and they probably didn't keep up with that subscription even very well. But that went a long way. And then the librarian, as she would get to a point where she would turn over the stuff, she asked me if I wanted those. So I took home some of the old model railroaders from, it would have been 1970 through 73 or about, and I kept referring back to them. I kept kind of reading them, and ultimately did get a subscription. I don't know what really instilled that direction. I mean, I liked slot cars. I did I collected Hot Wheels. I did a lot of different things, but I did finally just settle on model railroading.
Do you remember as you were going through those magazines, like any particular article that really like stood out to you that really was like kind of awe-inspiring, or was it just kind of like just information overload as you were going through these?
It was funny because it would be anything Great Northern related, just because that's what I knew and that's what I saw, and even Burlington Northern. But no, I don't remember any particular articles. Obviously, Gory and Defeated, and John Allen had big impact. Virginia and Ohio, I liked the look. I didn't even probably realize it wasn't a real railroad. But those kind of things really drew me to want to go into model railroading.
Yeah, for sure. Where were you sourcing product? I mean, back in those days, did you have like a local hobby shop?
Yeah, we had, the malls. And a lot of the malls here had a Gagers hobby shop. Okay. I don't know if that was a national chain or what, but Gagers was a go-to point. Even Woolworths had a little train section. And I remember even getting my parents to buy me an N-gauge Aurora postage stamp train set. Okay. And so I kind of veered off into that probably when I was about 12 or 13. Sure. And I actually did build a little 4-foot by 3-foot circle and put scenery on it and a tunnel. And it didn't run very good, but I think I still have it up in the rafters in the garage.
Well, that's good, because I was about to ask the Tony Cook inspired question. Do you still have your old trains?
I do have all of my old trains, and in fact, I did get my dad's Lionel train that was about a 1940 vintage, I think Sears catalog offering, and I have that on my display case in the basement, and I have my original M&L Lionel HO in my display case, and the N-gauge stuff not on display, but probably in boxes somewhere. I know I didn't ever get rid of them.
That's excellent. So this current the layout that you have starting somewhere in the early 80s, did that layout start to evolve at all during that time?
Yeah, I had started that railroad before the basement was finished. And then I met a guy in about 1984 at work who was just going to Votech in electronics to be an electrician. And he was into railroads. And he came out and saw my 10 by 22 and kind of thought, it'd be nice if we had a suspended ceiling and sheetrocked walls and and he said, I could design you one on the CAD system at school, a new layout plan. So we tore that one down in about 1985, 86. And he developed that new track plan, which once again ended up being a folded dog bone, because even at that point, we still weren't doing shelf layouts, or really weren't doing double decked. So we just got going on that, and we ended up taking a little more room. So there was nothing else in the basement except for the washer and dryer, and we continued to expand the railroad into the whole 22 by 22 foot room with of course, the support wall for the house up the middle, except for the open one end that was 10 feet that the original layout was in. So we did tear the original one down completely. Okay. Sheetrocked, suspended ceiling, and he came up with a decent folded dog bone that we started to commence on in about 1988.
Okay. We'll bring Junior in here. We're talking ages 5 to 8. Isn't it nice to be born in 1980? You can basically by the year know how old you were, right?
Absolutely. I'm June of 80.
Yeah, and I'm April of 80, so it's nice. Like 80, 81, I was 1, 82 was 2, and so on. So it's nice and easy. So
we're 43 this year.
That's right. That's right. I've hit it, and you're pretty close here, then, right?
Yep.
So anyway, what was your earliest memories of this? Do you remember the original and your dad upgrading the basement and doing all this stuff? Do you have a recollection?
I do remember the original. The original in that 22 by 22, as he said, is it was 10 by 22. So it was the back half of our basement. Right. And I remember that one. It was black fascia, and there's a little duct under. You kind of could duck under, and the engine facility was kind of in the center. And I just remember as a kid seeing that type of stuff. And as you're younger, obviously you're stepping up on stools and you're doing what you can to kind of see because the bench work is up a little bit higher. But I don't remember the actual disassembly of that railroad. I do remember, and I don't know, Dad, if you remember this, but he had a motorcycle that was in parts. That's all I remember. But there was a motorcycle that was taking place there. So I still did even get a little influence of the kind of the motorsports side of things, but I do recall seeing it. Was that in the basement?
No, that was in the second level. Our house is a 4 level, and the railroad was in the full depth basement. But it was a Husqvarna 250 WR that I had torn apart, and it was in the lower area, which later became your bedroom.
Okay, right.
And the staging area. So that's where I had it, and that was prior to finishing off that area.
Because as we fast forward to the new railroad being built, I fully remember that being assembled. They kind of mapped it out on the ground, kind of could tell where the actual layout would lay. And at one point during the construction, and this takes us back to 87, I thought it was the 91 World Series, but the Twins made it to the World Series in 87 and 91. And Colin and my dad were downstairs in the basement. I'm down there as well. And they wheeled the TV. It was at the top of the steps. Yep. And the TV was up there, and they had the ball game on. So that was kind of how we watched one of the games. I don't know which one it was, but the World Series was on. We're doing trains down in the basement. And one of the things that Colin, being our electrician, is obviously having to focus on a 5-cab system that he ends up installing. And I am a talkative person. And as a talkative person, even as a little kid, yep, I would chatter and chatter away, asking him all that I could about the electrical side of things, which paid dividends later in my career with the model railroading. Sure. But at one point, Colin says, "Billy, could you just hold it for a minute?" So I might have waited about maybe 15 seconds because he's trying to concentrate. He's trying to do a lot more complex stuff that was taking place. But sure, I was sucking as much information as I could out of, Colin, the construction. These guys are working on this stuff, and I'm having the opportunity to see it firsthand. So that's kind of my first recollection of the railroad starting up, or the current one that's there now. I vaguely remember the old one, but mostly the new one.
Yeah, so for senior, you get this this guy's helping you, which is really cool, helping with the wiring and electrical stuff. Tell us a bit about this. What you end up with? You talked about the dog bone and stuff. 6-cab system. Sounds like you were running a bunch of trains on this thing. Yeah,
like I said, he was going to school, going to Votech to be an electrician, and he's even today just a really talented electrician. He's a master electrician in the state of Wisconsin. He was licensed in both states, but I think he's kind of let the state of Minnesota's go because of the cost, and the company he works for pretty much just works in Wisconsin now. But there was early on, CTC 80 was coming up, and there were some memory throttles that somebody had put in model railroader to build your own memory throttle. And Colin took that on, and he built this just on a board, a memory throttle. So that wasn't the CTC 80, but it was a cab. So the cab control had a few stationary power packs, Tech 2 power packs, and then this walk around plug-in with a memory. So he put plug-ins around the layout, and that became kind of the mainline power pack. So that went a long way to move us in towards operation.
Where did the idea of operations come from to you? Was it through the magazines, or, I mean, you've got railroad in your blood. You've seen the railroad and what it actually does, which is not run in circles, but actually, deliver product and whatnot. So was operations incorporated early on, or is this something that kind of developed into your layouts?
Yeah, I'm not sure where I met Gary, but a local modeler up here is Gary Friesman, and he is a real proponent of operations, and I believe he has been operating the first Friday of every month for approximately 40 years. And wow. At one point, like I said, I can't even remember where I met him or how I got invited to his house, but it was come on over, check this out. And I did that, and I was working nights, so it was a little more difficult I'd have to take a vacation day to do a Friday night. So I couldn't become really a regular operator. But I did attend probably a half a dozen sessions over the course of a year and a half. So about 1993, he asked if he could come out and see our railroad, which he did, and brought a few of his friends, and they liked what they saw, and then they continued to tell us what we needed to do.
Okay.
Because to operate, you needed a little more than just a dog bone. So he encouraged us to somehow create a point-to-point. And we looked at that long and hard. But by about 95, 96, I would say, it was thought that we could cut into one of the two main lines. It was kind of a double-track main. And we cut into one of them, and Bill built a helix for me. So he was doing that while he was in high school. So that's how I can kind of keep my years straight. But he did build a helix. And then about that time, our electrician, Colin Mueller, was planning a move out of the cities. He had lived down by the fairgrounds and had a railroad in his basement. And he offered me his yard out of his basement and some of the infrastructure and everything. So we cut that out, and we put it in the back of a Suburban. It rested from the front dash and hung out the back window of this Suburban. Nice. And we drove about 40 miles northwest of the cities and brought this into our house through a basement window in the lower split level, and managed to work it all the way down into the basement and get it to swing around. And we had prepared a second deck, brackets, that we set that on, and that became our west end. So we did manage then to start into operations by creating what essentially became a point-to-point.
Nice. Now for Junior, 95, 96, we're 15, 16 years old. Do you remember this ride in the Suburban to go get this staging yard?
100%. I remember it was our neighbor across the street, Mark's Suburban, that we borrowed. And when we went down there, Collins, if you're familiar with any of the homes that are in St. Paul, it's not a huge meant, to have a full finished basement. It was finished off for the most part, but he had to then cut these things out. And I remember we got that thing up out of there, got it in, but it was getting down into the basement. And, if you think of the Friends episode with Ross yelling pivot, it's just, you had to get this big monstrous yard swung around. And, I'm attempting to help. I'm able to lend a hand. And I got to say, on that whole swing, there was just one little mark that we ended up really kind of on the one wall. My dad did airbrush clouds onto the wall to give ourselves a backdrop. And, I was like, oh, the one little hiccup, but we had to pivot. But it was good. It was fun. That was a lot of fun and definitely a memory.
And you stayed right into it. I mean, you're right there with him as he's adding to it, because like we talked about earlier with Senior, you hit those teenage years and boy, there's just a lot of distractions, but sounds like you were kind of right there with Dad.
Well, I think the fun part of it was, and it still is to this day, is that we go out rail fanning, and it is fun to be able to spend time with your dad. So his interest he used to take us into Shoreham Yard, which is the Sioux line here in the Twin Cities. And when we'd go in there to check that out, as a kid, you're just taking in everything you see. And I distinctly remember we went into Shoreham, and there's a certain point, I don't know exactly when that was, but they were bringing in chassis locomotives. We were seeing, there was in Boston and Maine or Penn Central, just seeing a lot of odd equipment, Conrail, and all this weird stuff was showing up. And I think my dad might have been going in to just see what was there. But as a kid, you're just thinking it's just trains, right? Well, for me, that's where that merger of the Sioux line was actually happening. And that's what brings interest for me to 85, 86, was seeing that stuff at first. And now I even reflect back at going over highway, when it was on 94, we'd actually go over what was known as Southtown Yard, and you could look down south. So as a kid, he'd always just go, look down there and see if there's anything. So I would sit up in my seat and I'd look down that way and see, a lot of times it was vacant tracks. There was very little that was there because it was getting pulled out. But that rail fanning side of things is what tied it in. And then bringing it to the interest of the railroading, I would say that we probably laugh harder when the two of us are down there just BSing about something, working on the railroad. So that camaraderie, it's like I said, it's still to this day. But as a kid, he's working on something. I might be trying to work on something, change couplers or something of that nature. And having gotten older, when they were building the Helix, I had the ability, like he cut all the circle pieces that I needed to be able to create the actual Helix itself, or, I would help cut it out with a jigsaw. And then we built with thread rods, and that's how our Helix is built, is thread rods, nuts, and then just basically a metal plate spacer that we could adjust.
Sure.
They started that first grade. Colin got the grade figured out and just said, okay, we'll keep going. We glued our cork bed down to the actual plywood, and then we applied our track. We'd glue the track and nail it periodically, putting expansion joints for both the plywood and the rails themselves. But having the opportunity to actually kind of do that, you kind of felt like you had a little bit more of a vested interest in the railroad.
Right.
But I think a big part of it was a lot of the research, right? So if we take back to being a kid and the magazines and the books that my dad had kind of mentioned, he also was bringing home the BN annual. So a BN annual would come out each year, and it had the roster of the locomotives. And that's what really cemented my detail interest, because he started getting a model, and then I would look at that BN annual and be like, well, it doesn't have the right horn, or this particular one has this type of beacon on it. So we started to kind of apply some of those little details. And then that library grew as we got a little bit older. Scott Thompson came out with a series of 3 Great Northern books, and they're just very, very well done. And that started to amplify that prototype side. And especially with that operations interest that started to come in, to me, I started to see railroading as almost a game. And it's like, oh, we got these cards match those cars. Now we get to go and switch these things around. Right. That's what really amplified my interest and kind of cemented it. I didn't have the opportunity to run at Gary's at a young age, but I did have the opportunity and still have as of late to go out and operate on his railroad. And you do get that idea of like, boy, this is fun. It gives the railroad a purpose, and that to me is what drew me in. And at that informative years, the 16, 17 years old, I eventually do get into the girls and cars and college and all that stuff. But I think a bigger part of it was the connection to be able to hang out with my dad, where he's young enough. I was getting older that we could, laugh about, talk about music and all the stuff that was going on in life. But the railroad just kind of gave us a common interest to be able to share ideas and stuff that we're looking at as far as the railroad is concerned.
Yeah, that's quite an amazing thing to have, a great connection with your dad. I'm very close with my dad, and it's really neat to see you guys connected as well. Though we didn't connect over trains, we connected more over cars and racing and those kinds of things, and maybe some sports. But really neat that you guys found like a really tight hobby. Although when Junior started that rivet counting stuff, were you accepting to that, or was that kind of, were you okay with it, or kind of along your line of thinking, or did it kind of drive you crazy?
No, I liked that. I'm probably not quite the proficient modeler that he is, but I appreciated the fact that he was trying to replicate what he was seeing in those BN annuals. And I had about 3 of them. Motive Power Services put them out, and boy, they were invaluable at that time, because even then we didn't have all the books, the Four Ways West and all these books that have come out covering all these railroads, and they're just fabulous forms of information for modeling. I've got roads, I've got those books now that are from all kinds of other railroads, connecting roads and stuff, just to get that information. So when he was replicating Burlington Northern engines, I thought it looks great.
Awesome. Great way to support it, and that fine detail that he was getting into. I want to go back to rail fanning a little bit. So how far did you guys have to travel to see these sites that you were talking about?
Most of them are going to be in the cities. We were bouncing around. It was Shoreham down. So Shoreham from our home in St. Michael is probably a 25-ish minute drive, maybe 30 minutes. And that's right off a university. And if you're familiar with the Twin Cities at all, there's Northtown Yard that's right there, Humboldt Yard. So you have Northtown, Humboldt, Shoreham. So those are Sioux Line. You got the BN that's coming in there. I found my interest in what was Southtown Yard down into the Hiawatha Elevated District. And again, that's just south of Minneapolis. All of this stuff is on the Minneapolis side, is not that far, so a half hour. But you go then another 15 minutes and you're in St. Paul, and then you've got yourself Pig's Eye, and you've got Westminster, and you've got so much more going on there, Union Yard. And there's just a lot of pieces of the puzzle all coming together in the Twin Cities. And one thing that we were introduced, and if anybody ever comes to the Twin Cities, we say the place to go is go check out the Minnesota Commercial. And you got Elko's running. And obviously right now we're starting to see there's possibly not going to be running those units. So having that opportunity to come in, I always say it's like going to look at the 57 Chevs, going to see the classics, because that stuff eventually will disappear. But most of the stuff was very close to us.
So when you were younger, what did these rail fanning trips kind of look like? It was like a, Saturday morning, we're going to get up early kind of thing. What was that kind of like for you guys?
Well, I don't think we were ever that organized.
It was just kind of spur of the moment, like, hey, let's go rail fan.
A lot of times after we went to flea markets, so if we went to a flea market, we'd swing by and check stuff out after. We still do that today. Again, we swing into the commercial. If we're at the State Fair flea market, we'll bebop right over to the fairgrounds and then swing in there because it's close. And it's a lot of times just to see what's moving, what they've stuck in the storage. With my kids, even right now, I go to Northtown and I will swing into, they created an overpass where St. Anthony, it's a road that crosses over, and there's a nice platform that you can hang out and stand on. Well, we'll go to a local, Mexican place, and we'll grab some tacos or chilitos, and we'll swing behind Home Depot, check to see if any trains are coming, then head down there and eat those. And we're just hanging out. I feel like that experience I had with my dad was a fun one that I hope my kids kind of can remember and enjoy, because it's kind of a shared mutual, entertainment, if you will, because you have so much traffic that was passing through that area. And they get to see a train every time. And thankfully for those guys that are running at Northtown, they honk, just a light toot, hong hong, and the kids just get excited.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a lot of fun. We watched 261 roll through there. I used to work right off of Jackson Street in Central, which is just north of Minneapolis Junction, and that's where the Milwaukee 261 is stored. So I'd see that. My dad and I, we went and chased the big boy when it came out, so we saw it. And then when I heard it was coming back from Duluth, I brought my kids down there and let them, see it. We're one of the few people in the middle of the day to be able to run down and see a train like that roll by. So it's kind of cool in that regard.
Yeah, for sure. When outsiders when I talk about rail fanning to somebody who doesn't understand, or maybe not a big train fan or not at all, I parallel it. They're like, oh, you go and sit by track. It's like, to me, it's like fishing. And I kind of think of it the same way. Like you pick a spot, you got your favorite spots, you go there, you sit there, and sometimes you get nothing, which was about all the times I've gone fishing, and you just come up empty. And I would say to him, I said, it's just like fishing, and just like fishing for me, at the end, you're still hungry. So, it's kind of neat. And, I think of the father and son thing going, gathering up to go fishing. I kind of think of, for you guys, it was kind of like, well, let's gather up and go rail fanning. And that's super cool.
Yeah, I did receive a 35 millimeter camera in about 1983. And unfortunately, I didn't start out shooting slides right away. It was expensive, film and developing, but at least I had gotten to a better format camera. So that also encouraged a little more rail fanning and getting out and taking pictures. But we didn't seem to do much for, planned trips. We went up to Superior and Duluth because that's where the grandparents were. So every time we'd be up there, we'd maybe drive around through the yard. Back in those days, late 80s, early 90s, you could drive around the Burlington Northern Superior yard and not have any issues. Of course, we were respectful and didn't ever probably more than get out of the car to snap the pictures. Never climbed on anything or anything like that, but
sure.
That was another destination always whenever we would go up north, to try to get away for an hour or two and check out the rail scene in the area. That's
fantastic. Be able to go up and, like the spots, these are kind of the areas that when you were younger, you were able to share with Junior.
Yep.
And that's where I think a lot of the stories tie in. I know it would be my great uncle Wally. He worked for the BN well into, his career, and to be able to see a lot of the stuff that these guys, as far as where they worked, and they'd point out like Grandpa's shed, or it would be my great grandpa, but, and it's not a shed, it was actually his office, but it was not there for me as a kid. But as we'd drive across those tracks, my dad would point out and said, it was right down in that area. So I could kind of familiarize the roundhouse. I remember the roundhouse being there, but then it got taken out very young in my time that I was there. And then when we were there, it was checking out a lot of times to be able to see, oh, it's a GP30. So I was identifying, again, back to the BN annuals, seeing locomotives that are now, in BN paint, but that could have been a CBQ. That could have been a Great Northern. What was the unit? So that was the interest too, as far as us as rail fans, to be able to see some of that stuff.
Yeah. So you're tracing railroad history, you're chasing a little family history all in one. That's definitely fantastic. So let's get back to the model railroading aspect. And, we left off kind of 95, 96, and the young Bill builds a Helix and adds that to the layout. You've got yourself involved in this operating with this Gary, who's kind of introduced you, and now you're doing that. When do you start kind of holding your own op sessions and bringing other people in? Did that start for you?
Well, we did basically use the same car card system that Gary Friesman used. He gave me a couple of blank ones, and I had showed him to my electrician, and his wife, his father owned a printing company. So he said, I could get these printed. And I still have probably a couple hundred car cards and waybills that, I'll never get around to using. But we must have printed 1,500, 2,000 car cards and waybills. So we did go down that road in the late 90s, into the early 2000s. And we did, tried to have our little operating sessions with just the three of us, and every now and then one or two friends. But even then, in the early 2000s, I don't know how big operations were compared to today. But we were trying, and even today we don't probably operate as much as we would like, but we were on our way in the early 2000s.
So the layout that you had in 95, 96, you had the helix, you get a staging yard from somebody put together. Is that the layout you currently have?
Yes.
Excellent. What kind of, and in what state is it? Like, is it 100% scenic? Where are you at with that layout?
Well, it's funny because you learn how important it is that you have bulletproof track work, and then you wanted to prove out this operating layout that if you wanted to make any track changes. So I really held off on doing much scenery for probably a good 10 years. And we did make some modifications in the yards, some just critical crossovers, just to make operations work better. So I was just proving out the railroad for such a long time that I was afraid to get into ballasting. I didn't want to have to start cementing my track in like that. I still wanted to be able to change things if I had to. So we kind of dragged that out a little too long. So even today, I've done a fair amount of ballasting, but I would say as far as scenic, it's maybe half. Probably like everybody, you need more trees, always need more trees.
Right.
I tend to we are modeling essentially, let's say St. Paul is our east end, and a small staging yard, which is underneath the main yard, which I would never do again.
Yeah, why is that?
I just didn't have enough clearance. Probably 4 or 5 inches. So even reaching under there is difficult. And while I have re-railers on the yard tracks down there, that doesn't always save you. And so that's more of a limited end, is our east end. And then the main yard is Union Yard. That was a Great Northern yard in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And we then go all the way west to Wilmer. So it's the Wilmer first subdivision of the Great Northern. And then we did continue a staging yard even a little bit further into his bedroom on the second level of the house. And that's a 10-track staging yard. So we do have plenty of room at that end. So a lot of trains terminate there, and they end up not having anywhere to go eastbound as much. But it's working for us right now.
Junior, did you have any issues with a staging yard coming into your bedroom?
No, the funny story and how it ended up coming in there was my dad ended up going out with my mom. They went out for dinner and left with Colin, myself, and another a former CP employee, Dave, that we all put it in while they were gone. So it was basically kind of a run and gun. And to give people an idea of how the railroad is set up, the house is a split level. So modified split, meaning you come in and then you can swing a right down a set of stairs. And off to the left, on the very back side of the house, would be my bedroom. And if you stayed along that staircase and went down into the basement, that obviously brings you down to the railroad. The main railroad's at about chest height. And then we have our second deck that's right about at eye level height if you're standing there. And that eye level height actually swings around perfectly when it goes through the wall. If you go back up those stairs, it's at about kind of mid-shin height. So you have a nice kind of a low level. I had no problem with it. The yard itself, I occupied trains were in there in my high school into collegiate years. And then after I had moved on, my younger sister then came in And when she came in, a little less care may have been had for some of the rail cars and stuff. So again, there was a point where my dad and I, we created basically a lift up lid system that would cover up that yard. And we created almost looks like a bench, and that hides the that upper hidden yard, which now if we do have operating sessions and stuff, we can prop those lids open, see all the cars, and obviously get in and out of there. But yeah, I definitely remember it. I had no problem with it. I highly encouraged it. May not have been a high on my mom's list as far as items to have put into my bedroom.
Right.
But at the time, it really did help facilitate the railroad. Our east end is a little light, as my dad mentioned. The west end, having as many tracks as it does, it allows us that opportunity to have a lot more trains that can kind of come into the scene, and then eventually we can spin them and then send them back.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to get to Junior here a little bit. You grow up with it. Obviously, you've got railroading in your blood. You've got many generations before you involved in the prototype and then now model railroading. And, you spent all this great time with your dad and, honing skills and building this layout that you had. And you mentioned your high school years, collegiate years, and then you move on. And we'll probably have to have you back just to hear your story from beginning to end, because we will, condense of time. But to me, it seems like you've got this huge leg up. You grew up around it. You got to see your dad build this layout. It's kind of propels you into the hobby.
Well, I think that's a big part of it. I mean, obviously being exposed, some of the things that people don't see, and even my dad may not have seen, was the learning curve that I was on when trying to create some of these more prototypical looking cars. I would take a 40-foot boxcar, and I don't even recall the original road that may have been on the car. And I was just trying to figure out, how do you strip paint? So some people are like, oh, you just use brake fluid. And I remember taking an RS-11 shell. It was a Lehigh Valley, and I dropped that baby into some brake fluid, and it softened up the shell. And I was like, this is not good. The paint came off, but then the actual finish started to get soft and details were starting to get lost. And I thought, well, this ain't the answer. So I cleaned that thing off, and then I ended up spraying it into NP paint. So that repainted unit was try to salvage it, but that's that learning process. And it's at the expense of some of my dad's equipment or power. And again, I don't even know. I mean, he may be able to confirm whether or not that was a green light project to do or not. But I took a car. I do distinctly remember it was, I want to say it was an Intermountain car that I stripped the thing completely. And I saw a Great Northern car that it was a double door, looked pretty close and accurate, painted it red, silver roof, applied the decals. And that was one that was very early that I thought separate grabs was interesting. So my collection of cars were going to be just separate grabs. And there were certain things that I was gravitating towards on the detail front. But that learning curve that happens, I mean, I'm grateful that whatever I did ruin or was trying to create some of these pieces, that, in the process of learning, at no point, I don't ever recall, my dad hasn't ever yelled, in any form of anger in the stuff that I may have been doing. He might have just gone, oh man, did you have to use that car, or whatever it may have been. Yeah. But I think that, to me, I mean, that also translates to our lives, because, I'm extremely grateful for, someone that's forgiving and understanding, but then also saying, hey, if we're going to do this, here's the tools that you might need. That even goes into the DCC, because Colin wanted to get into signaling. So I start digging into signaling, and now we need to get, the Digitrax boards that will talk and tell us, occupancy and all those pieces that start happening. As my dad even jokes that, the railroad wouldn't run if I wasn't there. If something happened to Colin or I, at a certain point it was Colin, because it was all DC. And he goes, if something happens to Colin, this thing it's going to be stuck right where it's at. And then we move it into DCC, and my wife and I bought my dad a Digitrax kit, so a starter kit that it was, oh, it's just easy. Take 2 wires and plug this in. We hear the common phrase.
Yeah.
And thankfully, Colin did such a nice job wiring the thing that we did literally pulled the A cab off. We plugged in our Digitrax system, turned everything to A, and then just started driving around to see where shorts were.
Nice.
That's how we kind of got into DCC. Nice. So it's a huge testament to the work that he did. But at the same time, that whole learning process, when you ask Ray, how do you kind of get into this? and these interests, it kind of helps to be able to have, somebody saying, hey, give it a go. Let's see if we can get the thing to work. I mean, we've probably put decoders into, every bit of 60, 70 some locomotives over the past few, years, and then upgrading from the first ones we started with. And all of that's a learning curve, right? I mean, we get to that point of trying to figure out what works, what doesn't. So, I mean, if there are any older modelers that are out there with younger kids that are interested, give them a freight car, give them something to be able to try it out on, to be able to learn from. Because along the way, I know that I didn't get to where I was at right out of the gate, and none of us do. All the great modelers that are out there had to kind of start somewhere, and I'm not putting myself in that group of great modelers, but I always try to rather get to the levels that they do by observing what they're doing and then trying to replicate it.
For Senior, it seems like you paid a little bit of his model railroading tuition with some of the cars that may have got messed up or whatnot, but I'm sure it's paid dividends for you too. The stuff that he's learned to come back to your railroad and be able to make improvements and be able to apply that in both places. Absolutely.
He's just quite an artist in many senses. And I don't ever remember even necessarily giving him the green light on a lot of those projects. I think he just picked something and went ahead with it. And it never really bothered me. In fact, I think I still have that Northern Pacific. It's an RS-11 that we still may even be running. So it's all that learning curve that has just worked out great for us.
So for those fathers that are listening now who have a child that's interested in the hobby, what would be some words of wisdom that you could give them to keep their child as enthusiastic as Junior was in this?
Well, I, had the interest myself, so I guess it would be important if the dad would have the interest himself. So with that interest, I, of course, bought him his first train set of his own when he was probably 8-9 years old. And I didn't ever get upset if he wanted to change things, and I allowed that exercise of changing track and doing what he wanted to do. And a lot of it then bled into my own railroad. If he wanted to run his equipment then on my layout, he could do that too. But so I just always encouraged the exercise and artistry that he displayed, and and that carried through later in his life, that he went into the direction he did in the field. That I think he had a lot of practice in those early years of painting and custom painting these box cars and rolling stock, and I think that's just a big part of it. It's just encourage the kids to have a good time with the hobby. You don't want to turn them off to anything that you could encourage them in.
And I think one of the advice or pieces I've heard my dad actually mention too is we're at flea markets and we see, father-son combinations or a grandfather and a grandson. And I know one of the last ones we were at, there was a gentleman, and my dad shared the story. He might even be able to elaborate a little bit on it, but the guy was looking for a locomotive, and he just helped steer him towards a locomotive that wasn't going to maybe frustrate him. And I don't remember the exchange, but Dad just briefly touch on just showing him the type of motive power that may bring a kid interest and less frustration.
Yeah, I just they were looking at like an old Tyco Elko. I'm sure it's a pretty 1980s probably from a set that they were kind of looking at, and it was about $12 or $15, and I kind of said to him, you can probably find something like an Athearn Blue Box engine for about that same price if we look around. It was a pretty big flea market, and they thanked me and they passed on that particular purchase. And I ran into them probably a half an hour later, and they didn't have anything in their hands. And I said, how is that going? And I happened to run across some Athearn Blue Box for 15, 17, 20. And I thought, boy, this is right up their alley. And I said, let's go over here and let me show you something. And they ended up buying several things right there. And I think that just helped them because they were just getting into it. It was a grandfather and his grandson. And later, come to find, his dad came to me and said, I want to thank you for that. That's really nice that you steered us in that direction, because I think you can't go wrong with a flywheel equipped Athearn. That's with the gold flywheels. So, the brass flywheels, so that I think is a whole lot more reliable engine, and hopefully will suit them further in the hobby.
You're 100% on that. Those old Tyco Alcos look perfect on Tony Cook's shelf where he collects them. But as far as trying to run these things, and nothing is worse than leading to having a kid put a train on and it doesn't run, or frustrate and stops, and they'll be out of the hobby in no time. So some very solid advice there. It's worth spending a little bit more money and making it so that they stay enthused about the whole thing.
And that's where I was too, because my set was a Bachmann set. It was a Burlington Northern F9, and it wasn't, it was better than, something that just was, an older generation. But I had been then upgraded to, I remember it was an SD40-2. It was, do you remember that? It was navy blue with the state of Minnesota spray painted on the side of it. That was an Athearn unit. So then to me, I thought, well, that's a better running engine than this, this Bachmann one. And as we fast forward, then when I did get into college, I do know that we were selling some stuff off. And my dad even asked me point blank, he goes, do you want to keep your original set that you had as a kid? And I was like, I wasn't really going to be, I wasn't attached to it. I had better stuff going. So then we let that go. And, it's always one of those things now when I see those pieces, I can see the cars that came from that set. I remember the Rock Island car. I think one of them was a Morrison Knudsen, like a gondola or a hopper. And then obviously the BN F9. And then I don't recall what the caboose was. The caboose, it was the hip roof. Was it the hip roof BN?
Yeah,
it was a matching caboose.
Like the
but some of those pieces are the things that tie you back to as a kid. But for me, my first train set, was one of the biggest ones you could ask for. That's the way I kind of then saw it, because once he let me start running on it,
yeah,
and then I had those ones shuffling around. Well, these ones aren't as fun as those other ones. And then that's where those details came together, and obviously fast forward to where we are today. And we're still running, we're still operating. The car card system that we were using was just a 2-sided waybill system that now we've advanced to JMRI, and we're using, and obviously a printed out switch list. So many things evolve with the hobby, but as it does, those are the things that make it enjoyable, seeing those improvements. If anybody ever sees the GN in 1970, if you're ever on YouTube, you can type in GN 1970, you'll see Bill Sr.'s railroad, and the majority of the scenery that's done on it has been done by him. I've done little bits here and there, but it's very cool to see now for me to be able to go out there, and he's like, I ballasted the main line from here to here. And I'm like, well, it's only like 3 feet. And he says, well, it took me, so long to take it to get that far. So it's just chipping away at it.
Yep.
It's a little bit at a time. It does take a lot of time, but operations was always our first and foremost. But I think that social dynamic that he and I have, like I said, there are times when we're down there talking about stuff, and I don't laugh as hard, just in everyday life as I do sometimes when we're down there working on the railroad, because of the things that we're just going off on tangents.
Yeah, for sure. I kind of the name of the podcast of Around the Layout, it really is that conversation, that great stuff that happens when you're hanging out, working on the model railroad, and those conversations that are non-model railroad, they're just even more fun. And that connection that obviously that you both have made, father and son. For Senior, you mentioned that you knew that Junior was really creative and an artist and whatnot, but when you turn on YouTube and you watch Sue the Milwaukee Road, did you know that he was that funny and he was also that creative on that side of things?
Yeah, I think I had that inkling years ago that that might happen. He really came out after his sister went off to college and became a lot more popular in high school, and I think even did a Seinfeld bit at one of the talent shows at school, and so I kind of had an idea that he could be capable of something like this.
Well, he does a phenomenal job with it. It's highly entertaining. I love watching your updates, and you've done an excellent job with really high quality editing and production value. Just really fun to watch. So really cool that you're able to share the hobby out, not only with your own Railroad Junior, but also your dad's, and you still keep that all connected.
Yeah, I think that's what is fun about it. I do think, I mean, obviously the Seinfeld reference that he made back in high school, I did wear basically the white tennis shoes, blue jeans, blue shirt, and was the MC at one of the talent shows and did some of the stand-up bits. And we still, even to this day, and as you see in some of the videos, I throw Seinfeld clips in there just because that's kind of part of my 90s era upbringing.
Sure.
And, it just even something as subtle as one of the Seinfeld clips that's, hello, la, la, la. There's just one little one-liner like that to me. I mean, we might say it and, it gets a good laugh. And obviously from a comedy standpoint, I feel like the hobby itself is entertainment. And if we can bring entertainment into the hobby, I know there are a lot of people that, they kind of cringe and think, well, geez, you're putting all this extra jibber jabber and noise. I just want to see, some modeling tips. But a lot of it, and for people that don't know, it's more to make my dad laugh, and even just people that know me and fellow modelers that might get some of the inside jokes. There was Marco Scandella that used to be play for the Wild. We used to call him Deli, and it was always Deli. So if you ever see an episode and that sound drop happens, I use it periodically. That's a lot of times just as a laugh for the people that know what deli is. It's more delicate.
Yep. Nice. Well, it sounds like you guys are connected on just so many levels, and you can thank, model railroading kind of in the center of all that is super cool that, you talk about, again, the heritage of your family to the model railroading, sharing that father and son relationship. Definitely something really nice to think about as we head towards Father's Day. Just really cool to hear your guys' story, and we'll definitely have you both back on, maybe separately as well, because there's a lot more story I'm sure we got to tell between both layouts, but really cool to be able to get you both on here and hear how you've connected.
Yeah, well, thank
you, Ray. And I do want to say to all the fathers that are out there, I mean, one, happy Father's Day, but two, spend more time with your dad if you don't spend enough time with him already. Obviously clock is ticking for every one of us. And if you've got kids, spend your time with your kids, because that time, once it's gone, obviously it's gone. You can't get it back. I mean, I do miss my grandpa, which is my dad's dad, and having the opportunity to be able to get together. Maybe it's a phone call. Maybe it's work on a railroad. Maybe it's going to be go golfing or whatever it might be. Take that time, and as busy as all of our lives get, especially even with our kids, I wouldn't trade up a minute for the time I spend with my dad, whether it's model railroading, just hanging out, or just having a conversation on a podcast with a guy that's out on the East Coast.
For sure. Senior, you've raised a good one here.
Yeah, thank you, Ray.
So again, gentlemen, thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing your story.
Thank you, Ray.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's show on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Around the Layout. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at patreon.com/Around the Layout podcast. Past episodes and more can be found on our website, aroundthelayout.com. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.